Wonderful. Good morning, Amanda.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm well. I'm well. Thanks for chatting with me today.
I'm glad to chat. I'm all about chatting today.
First off, how you feeling these days?
Hanging in there. I'm doing good. I'm gonna probably have to go back into some treatment starting next week. I'm not sure yet. I'm still waiting to hear what the final decision is going to be, but a couple little blips. So, but I'm good. I've got lots of energy and I'm working like a dog.
I have no doubt. I feel like it's been a year since you and I really sat down and talked. We talked about the role of LEMs last year, and we talked about that. But I wanted to talk with you today about All Saints and All Souls Day. So this is going to be Ministry Monday's episode for All Saints and All Souls, and I wanted to talk about holiness. Holiness. So starting with that, many of us, I'll just speak for myself. I growing up as a kid, I always had one of those like hardback books that had like the saints in it. There was always nice illustrations for children. And to me, saints and holiness seemed so unattainable. It was like this group of people that just somehow, exceeded superseded the challenges of daily life and were these incredible examples of faith. So, I'd love for us to talk today about how do we identify holiness in one another? And then how can we acknowledge the fact that we also are holy?
Okay, I think those are two really good questions. So I think I agree with you. When I was younger, which is a little longer than you, and especially because I'm a pre-Vatican II baby, because so holiness, those little hardcover, little gold leafed First Communion prayer books that we would get would show pictures of saints, and Jesus, on the cross with all kinds of blood and stuff on him, and we were called to be called to holiness. So I think this has been a quest for me personally. I'm so glad you asked me to do this, because it's a quest. Where does that come from? And I am now convinced more than ever it's being faithful to the baptismal promises that either we made or were made for us, and we at some point acknowledged and said we would do. So, for the first part of baptism, it's a journey of holiness. It's a call to holiness. So the way that would get lived out would be, how do I use the gifts that God has given me? How do I use the gift that the life that God has given me? And how do I grow in my understanding of who God is in the process, and who I am as a son or daughter of God? When the priest or deacon pours water over us and anoints us, he says that we are priest, prophet, and king or queen. And so with that, it's like, okay, so here we've got all the resources that we need in order to live this life of holiness. So now it's my responsibility at some point to take ownership for that, and then to move forward with it with the grace of God and of course the Holy Spirit. I don't want to make it sound like, you do this. We are agents, and we certainly have free will, but God is the one who initiates this whole process, even our baptism. So I think that's that call to holiness. So then we look at these saints and say, so how did they do that? What is it? There was like these, the instant saints where they actually were martyred. And so, and we still have martyrs. We have still people being martyred to this day who, on many different levels, where they choose not to give up their faith, or they choose to proclaim their faith by giving up their lives. And so basically a martyr is a witness. That's what the word martyr means, to be a witness. And so really the whole saint journey, or whole saint calendar that we have, started with those people who were witnesses, who were martyrs, who would not give up their faith, who would not relinquish their faith, who would not dilute it or anything else. And so we looked to them, and people were really astounded that people would like get their heads chopped off because they believed that Jesus was the Son of God, and they were willing to die or getting eaten up by lions or whatever. You know, we have those stories in that little book that you're talking about. So, yeah. So sainthood is being faithful to who God has called me to be as a son and daughter of God. That's what I think a martyr is. That's what a saint is someone who has been faithful to the call that God has given them throughout their life. And, you know, people like St. Augustine, who lived a life of, you know, kind of debauchery, let's just call it that, for so many
Right.
years. And then he like decided instantaneously, you know, through a conversion experience, to be a faithful person of God. And then from that point on, that's who he was. So he became, I think a saint is also very single-minded and single-hearted. Their whole being is for God. Look at Teresa of Calcutta. You know, if you would put like Teresa of Calcutta and Janis Joplin together, both of them are people who were very spirited and full of energy and passion. But unfortunately, Janis Joplin's passions kind of took her away from the true self that she was, where the passion that Teresa of Calcutta had was leading her toward her true self, and she journeyed with that, even to the point, you know, when you read about her, that she lived like this perpetual dark night of the soul. Once she said yes to God, there was like decades where she didn't feel God's presence. So in a way, that was almost like, I would say, that was almost like a martyrdom, because she was willing to witness her faithfulness even when she didn't sense or feel God was present. So I think another aspect of being a saint is not the emotion, it's the faithfulness. I think sometimes I will speak for myself, I can't speak for anyone else, I weaken because I don't feel. So if I don't feel that God is present, then somehow it's like, well, I'm just gonna, like, you know, eat a pound of chocolate, who cares? Kind of, you know, so I think that's sort of really, you know, that whole thing about sainthood is that faithful, pointed journey to who God has called us to.
So then as we pivot then, and you've mentioned this, you know, of course, our baptismal calling. I'm just going to shoot you straight here. I mean, what if someone's listening and they're not sure what their baptismal calling is? How do they, you know, listen to that calling from God a little bit closer?
I think that's a good question. And my response to that would be, find a spiritual director who can help listen to what you say, you know, and say, you know, I have one. And so that's very important, because I'll say, well, what do you think about this? Or I'm feeling this, or when I pray, I hear this, or, you know, I'm experiencing all these things. What do you think God is saying? I think God is saying this. How does that sound? You know, and of course that's bounced off of who I am, who that person knows me to be, who I know myself to be, how that fits into the tradition and scriptures and all those kind of things, in terms of knowing, okay, this is my calling. You take an example, again, I can only speak for myself, I can't speak for others, but I was a music minister full-time for 47 years. And it just like, I was done. I just knew that I had done that portion. The problem was, okay, if I sense that, then what do I do next? Do I retire? Do I go into another ministry? What do I do? And I was really pondering that. So I started talking that through with my spiritual director and came up with 3 options: continue to stay in the ministry I was involved in, go in another direction, or become a full-time pastoral minister. And so the short story is that the pastoral ministry aspect is what really kind of stood out, and the doors open for that opportunity to happen. So for me to move out of that realm now, not to say that I'll still play the piano and I'll still sing or whatever, or compose, it just means that my focus, my primary ministry is this. So that's where I'm kind of single-hearted and minded right now, hoping that, you know, I'm staying within that realm. But there's going to be a time soon where I'm going to have to look at that again, because I'm getting older. You know, how much can I keep the pace up that I'm going? and what would be the next step that God is going to call me to. So that's the whole thing about calling, discernment, and then obedience too. And I think that's also part of an ingredient of holiness. And what the saints do, watch what they did. Today we celebrate the feast of Saint Teresa of Avila. She was a great reformer of the community she belonged to. And if she wouldn't have listened to God, the community would not have been reformed. But she heard God saying, you need to do this. And she moved on it. And so the community was able to kind of write itself anew again by the renewal of the charism of the community. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but
It does. It definitely does. I really appreciate you mentioning, though, that sometimes our calling and what we're supposed to be doing to follow God's will can shift over time. And a part of what we thought was maybe our forever calling is maybe changing. I mean, a really good example is what you just said. Maybe music ministers or full time and then they shifted, or here's another one. Maybe women listening to this podcast have a shift to motherhood and find a very large shift where they thought they would be full time in ministry or whatever they were doing previously. And then their ministry changes to motherhood. I so appreciate you pointing that out, that it's not, our calling with Christ is not one pegged item, or it doesn't have to be one pegged item or vocation or work for our entire life.
right. And I think also too, our prayer time is a dialogue with God. And oftentimes I come in with my shopping list, if you will, with prayer. I need to pray for this, or I need to pray for this person, or da 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 da.
Yeah.
But part of it's not a monologue, it's a dialogue. So then we also have to take time to listen, to give ourselves that space to hear what God is saying to us. And I think that's important to help us discern where God is calling us. And if God is calling us to shift and move, and then the choice that we have to then to obey that process. And sometimes we don't have control over those situations. Let's say, for instance, if we're working as music ministers and all of a sudden the budget in the parish collapses, and I think many of us may have experienced that through the COVID pandemic. So what happens then? Do I fight? Do I, kind of clench my fists and teeth and say, I'm holding on to this, even though it's obvious this isn't going to continue? Or do I open my hands and my heart and say, okay, God, what are you saying to me? Where do you want me to go? And I think, again, I kind of want to revert back to spiritual direction, because many of the saints that we honor, the martyrs certainly didn't have that, but I'm thinking of more modern day saints, had spiritual directors, had a mentor, a spiritual guide to walk with them, to help them see where the Lord was taking them. And I think that's important. And I really value that time, because and I'm kind of a little selfish with it too. It's like I really wanted to squeeze as much out of that time I have, because there's a lot going on. And so again, if we were going back to All Saints, this is what we celebrate. We celebrate authentic spiritual journeys of individuals who were willing and are willing to witness the faith.
That's great. I will tell you, I personally have never had such a beautiful and simple way of describing All Saints Days, just authentic spiritual journeys. Wow. I love that. Now here's a question for you, Brother Louis. Speaking of saints, is there a saint that you particularly look up to and pray for the intercession of, or or inspired by their story?
Yeah, there's two. One is obviously Francis of Assisi, because Francis is who I'm trying to follow in terms of the spirituality and charism. So yeah, I look to him all the time, and so his love of creation, his love of obedience, and obedience, not blind obedience, but that whole idea of being open to God and listening to God and letting God speak. Is very important. And he embraced the gospel. I mean, the gospel was everything to him. And so Jesus was everything to him. And so those are the things that I look at and say, boy, can I say that? Can I mirror that? The other saint is Saint Joan of Arc. And I know people would think that's kind of a bizarre saint for me to be with, but the thing about Joan is she knew who she was. She knew what God was saying to her. She heard the voices. She knew that God had a plan for her. And she did not waver from that. She did it. And she was faithful to that. And so I love that aspect, because sometimes in ministry, you have to be rough and tough in a pastoral way, but you still have to make decisions. You have to move, and you have to, if you know that you know, then you know, and you have to move it. I mean, look what she was able to do. I mean, they were impossible situations that she walked through. You'll never, Joan of Arc, lead the army of France. You'll never do that, but she did. They were, these ultimatums that were given to her. She sliced right through them. And unfortunately, toward the end of her life and her ministry, she got bad advice, and so that was where some of the failures in her experience in happened. But she was strong in her faith, and she believed and moved forward, and I like that. So I do go to her a lot because of that. And if you ever read the trials of which she had to go through. I mean, I've read all of them, and just fascinated by her faith and her strong will that she had, because she believed that God was calling her to be that person.
Now, we've talked about two saints who, of course, led the example through, like you said, bold faith and that self-assurance, knowing that they're following God's calling. My other question to follow up is, are there any people in your life today, persons or people, that emulate a holiness that you also seek to have yourself and imitate?
My spiritual director, I have Murray Bodo. Father Murray Bodo is my spiritual director. And I think, again, he's a Franciscan, and he's very, very human. And I mean that in a good way. He's holistic. So it's not like the spiritual life is like this detached head and then the body kind of Thomistic approach. It's very incarnational, which is what Franciscan theology and spirituality is about. So I'm looking, I mean, we talk about how is God moving in people, places, and events. How does God move in that? What is that, and I see him in the many books that he's written, his poetry. You get this sense that this is a man who's wrestled with a lot of interior things, has come out, with a strength and a surety and a peace, a deep, deep peace of knowing who he is in the presence of God. And so I look forward to talking with him about these spiritual things, because that's kind of how I get righted. My rudder gets kind of off base, but it's like, oh, that's right. I'm supposed to be, I'm not looking at this from an incarnational way. I'm looking at this as a Canter way. It's got to be done. This has to be this has to be that. And where's God in all that? And that's what he does. He'll stop and say, well, so where's God in all of that? Or is that a lot of Louis and just like a little piece of God? Where's the balance? Where's the holistic approach to that? See? So I really admire him. The other person I admire very much is Father Tim LeBeau, who's my pastor. And again, he's not Franciscan, but he's very authentic, and I think he's a very balanced person. And I admire his energy, I admire his vision, because what we're doing in our little cluster or collaborative or whatever you want to call it is something that's new. So we're kind of pioneering this process here in our diocese, and he's got a vision, and he's sticking with it. I mean, he's obviously obedient to the bishop and all that kind of stuff, but we're sort of like doing what we need to do. And he's given me a lot of opportunities to explore ministry in different ways. So I admire that.
One of the things too, I'd love to just touch base before we wrap up, is the fact that spiritual direction is something that I would love for us as pastoral musicians to take on as more of a personal priority. because I once had someone describe to me that one of the beautiful things about pastoral music is that God flows through us in our music and provides the presence of God to others, even when we may not feel like it or feel it. We
Hmm.
could be tired, we could be distracted. I just used this example a couple weeks ago where, we're trying to focus on the liturgy, and you're watching, why did the altar server just run off the altar? Is he okay? Is he getting sick? Oh, wait a minute, the priest's mic is still on and he's coughing into the mic. Or, oh, why is the second reader coming forward early? Like, we have so many things that I think we get distracted in, and yet we are providing such a presence. But I would love it if, as pastoral musicians, we found more of a priority that we acknowledge that through a spiritual director and spiritual guidance, because I think sometimes when spirituality is at the core of what we do so much, that I'm not sure that we take enough time to reflect upon it ourselves.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think, I mean, and I have done that myself where I've been so busy, I don't have time. There have been
Yes.
stretches in my career where I have just said, oh, I can't do that. I don't need it. But the thing is like but then there's symptoms that kind of come up,
Mm-hmm.
that sense of burnout, or of dryness, or disclarity, cloudiness, or purpose, even a cloudiness of purpose. And spiritual direction helps you kind of see where all these different pieces of my life, again, speaking for myself, it's pieces of my life fit together, and it doesn't make sense. I mean, isn't it insane to work 80 hours a week as a pastoral musician? Absolutely. Where's the balance? And the spiritual director will say, so what's your day off?
Right.
Are you praying? I mean, are you taking adequate time to pray? And that, not the shopping list prayer, but just to be in the presence of God. And I know as a music minister, I need that. I need to pray. I need to, as a pastoral minister, but we need to pray. We can't minister where we're not. So I agree with you. If I want to be a saint in the sense of whole person in the presence of God and be faithful to the call that God has given me, I need to pray, and I need to have someone to kind of walk with me and say, hey, you're doing great with this. You might want to look at that, or those kind of things. And it's important, actually, and especially for those of us in pastoral ministry, music ministry, we're doing spiritual things, so we should have someone to walk with us with that. I totally
Exactly.
agree. And
Mm-hmm.
and ask Teresa of Avila or any of the saints, that that we honor and think about. That's important.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because
I
what
agree.
voices are we listening to? Are we listening to God's voice? Are we listening to my voice? Or are we listening to the devil? I mean, I have to say that because what are we hearing? What are we listening to? And the spiritual director will help us read through some of that.
Well, I'll tell you right now, Brother Louis, I don't have a spiritual director, but after this conversation, I'm sure going to be looking one up in my region. So I appreciate that. I appreciate your insistence because, like you said, I mean, I think it's so important, especially for those who are ministering. It's kind of like, this might be a poor analogy, but it's like when you go on a plane and they always say if the oxygen mask drops, you need to put your mask on before helping others. Like, I mean, how often do we as pastoral musicians, how often do we prioritize our spiritual health and our spiritual development before we help others develop their spirituality through our music? I mean, maybe you're listening to this podcast and you have a great rock solid self-care in terms of spirituality. Good for you. I do not. I will openly admit that it's something that I need to work on.
Yeah, and you're right. I think that's a great analogy. You put the mask on before you put it on to the next person. So do you have your spiritual mask on so that you can share that spirituality with those people that you are ministering to through your music, and the people that you're ministering with, the choir, the instrumentalists, those kinds of. I mean, I think that's a beautiful analogy, and I'm going to use that if that's all right with you. I love it. I think that's great.
Please, please do. I'd be glad if you did. Be happy if you did. And so I'm so grateful for your time today to sit on this All Saints Day, because that's when this will be released, and just truly think about, how am I doing with my authentic spiritual journey? I think that's such a great focus. So thank
Right.
you.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome.